West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Chef Justice Putnam. Netrootsradio.com.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ma fleur sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte.
We learned Friday that Jack Smith's January 6th investigators sought information from Georgia Governor Brian Kemp in his probe of Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. News of this comes as we not only await a possible indictment of Trump in that case, but as we're also waiting for similar action by Fulton County, Georgia DA Fani Willis, who's been investigating election interference there. And a key piece of evidence is what Trump has described as his perfect phone call to Georgia's Secretary of State.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
According to NBC News, indictments in Fani Willis's sprawling investigation could be handed down as soon as a week from tomorrow. Joining me now, former House Impeachment Manager in Trump's second impeachment and chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado, and Charles Coleman Jr., civil rights attorney, former Brooklyn prosecutor, and MSNBC legal analyst, and the host of the Charles Coleman podcast. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Sunday Show. So, Charles, what do you make of Special Counsel Jack Smith requesting information from both Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and the Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger?
Well, Jonathan, prosecutors are going to go where the facts take them. And it's clear that Jack Smith is going down a road of where facts are taking him around not only January 6th involvement, but also election interference. And so his case is expanding to other jurisdictions where it is clear that Donald Trump was meddling and attempting to overthrow the election's results. And so that's why we're seeing this sort of expanded probe in terms of his investigation. And I suspect it's going to further influence whether we will see an indictment move forward and a prosecution on not just January 6th, but also election interference.
Right. And I left out the key part of my question, especially with a formal indictment imminent. I mean, right. Trump told the world that he got the target letter a week ago today. So what should we take from the fact that, you know, Raffensperger and Kemp are getting requests for information from the special counsel after that target letter went out?
The easiest thing that you can surmise from all of this is Jack Smith can do a number of things at one time. He's not limited to just focusing on Mar-a-Lago or January 6th. If the facts lead him to discover that more crimes have been committed, more indictments will come.
One more question to you, Charles, before Congressman, I promise I'll come to you. We're talking about two overlapping investigations. Right. There's special counsel's investigation, and then there's also Fulton County DA Fani Willis's investigation at the state level. Are they coordinating?
Probably not to a high degree. I think that there may be information that's shared between the two parties that wouldn't necessarily be unusual. But with respect to timing, for example, there's been a lot of conversation about how the different indictments could impact Donald Trump's schedule, especially in light of his campaigning around the 2024 election. With respect to that, I don't necessarily anticipate that they would be coordinating because Vonnie Willis is on an independent track as a state and local prosecutor. And Jack Smith is moving forward as a special counsel for the Department of Justice. So I don't necessarily know that either is worried about stepping on the other's toes, and that's ultimately going to be something that's sorted out in court anyway. So they may be sharing information, but as far as when to bring the indictments and scheduling, that's probably not something that they're worried about.
Okay, and Congressman, you were an impeachment manager in Trump's second impeachment, and that was all about January 6th. Were you surprised that incitement to insurrection was reportedly not mentioned in the target letter that Trump received from the special counsel?
Well, first, it's great to be with you, Jonathan. I agree with my colleague, Congressman Schiff. It's premature at this point. We don't necessarily know what charges the special counsel or the grand jury are necessarily contemplating. Of course, as you said, the only reason that we know any of this is because the former president disclosed his receipt of a target letter, which is clearly a very serious legal development. And we know from some reporting about the specific charges that were apparently referenced does not mean that the grand jury or the special counsel isn't looking at other charges or that they very well may pursue charges with respect to those statutes. What I would say is I trust the special counsel and the Department of Justice to faithfully execute their duties. We have an independent, impartial Department of Justice for a reason. And I think the special counsel has thus far pursued his duties in that way. And, I think it's important for it to be free of political interference. I'm far more concerned, to be candid, about some of what you showed at the top of the program, the ominous things that former President Trump has said leading up to so many of these different indictments and sort of undermining the fundamental rule of law, which is sacrosanct in our country.
Well, speak more about that, because as I said in the intro to this, to A Block, when Donald Trump sweats, he starts threatening people, and he starts putting out threats, whether it's the nation or individual people. He's gone after the special prosecutor. He's gone after the special prosecutor's wife. Why is that so dangerous? And can those threats be used against him in a court of law?
Yeah, with respect to your latter question, I'll defer to my friend, Mr. Coleman, who's active.
Right. And I realized that the moment it came out of my mouth.
But I will say this. This is not surprising. It's consistent with his course of conduct. He did this throughout his presidency, constant challenges to the rule of law, undermining the rule of law, the independence of the Department of Justice, veiled threats and the like. And unfortunately, that kind of conduct has metastasized in the modern House Republican caucus. We see that on full display every day in the House. I would like for my colleagues to take a step back, recognize again the independence and the impartiality of the Department of Justice from a law enforcement standpoint, and let the special counsel do his job and, again, decide what charges, if any, that ultimately he'll pursue.
One more question to you before I get Charles to answer that legal question that I asked you. The Speaker McCarthy saying that he supports expungement of the two impeachments. As Congressman Schiff said, there's no constitutional basis for this. But what's the Speaker up to by even talking about this?
Yeah, there's no constitutional basis to pursue this. Every legal scholar that has looked at it has said it's constitutionally dubious. This is another example of Speaker McCarthy, unfortunately, capitulating to the far right wing of his caucus, which has taken control of the House Republican caucus. He could be spending his time pursuing policies that actually matter to the American people, lowering costs, as House Democrats have done, growing the middle class. Instead, you find him again and again pursuing these, again, far right kind of political sideshows. You see that in the hearings that are happening every week, total waste of taxpayers' dollars. And now apparently pursuing this expungement, which of course has no legal meaning. You can't erase that the president acted the way he did on January 6th and in the days leading up to it, and that he was ultimately impeached for it and faced real consequences.
Mm-hmm. Oh, because we saw what we saw.
Yeah, we lived
live.
It.
Yes, and you lived it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So back to the legal question that I asked the congressman, but you are better qualified to answer, and that is the threats that Donald Trump is making, both on his social media platforms, but also in radio interviews, campaign rallies. Can they be used against him in a court of law?
They can't until they can. And what do I mean by that?
Yeah, I was going to say what?
Donald Trump has a history. This is a pattern of pushing the limit around fiery and dangerous rhetoric until he is held accountable. And that's not only in the criminal realm, it's also in the civil realm. If you think about the fact that this man is about to go to trial again with Elin Carroll in New York because of things that he violated after already being told, stop that. If you think about the fact that he also had an issue with respect to the judge here in New York with respect to the Alvin Bragg case. In that case, also talking about the judge, fiery rhetoric, dangerous, that really told the line. And then, of course, going to the ellipse, January 6th, this rhetoric ultimately sparking what was a Capitol insurrection. Until someone holds him accountable, and they can, it's ultimately going to be a question of, does someone act at his behest? Does someone act influenced by his actions? Did that inspire someone to do something that was harmful? The rhetoric itself is on the line. What takes it over the line of legality, Jonathan, is what happens afterwards. Unfortunately, we have to get too close to that line for any of us and any of our comfort before a legal decision can be made.
And one last question real quick. The classified documents trial has been set for May 20th, 2024. You're the lawyer. Should we expect even that date to be pushed back?
No, not at all. I think that even without any other argument for Donald Trump, the natural course of litigation is going to push that further than May 20th, 2024. A case like this, you're going to have lots of motions around discovery, lots of disputes, and that's going to push it further into the summer next year.
Oh, so it could. So May 20th, 2024, that date can be pushed.
Oh, yes.
Will be pushed.
Yes,
all right.
It is Monday, the 24th of July of 2023, and you are in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I am your chef de cuisine, Justice Putnam. Gunner the English Bulldog is our snoozing sous chef. Precious, our little Yorkie, is our door girl, and she will be seating you directly for our especially special daily special, River City Hash Mondays, because on Monday, you know what we do. Yes, we mull it over. Yeah, well, it looks like another criminal indictment could be imminent. I love that, meaning it could come at any moment or not, but it is imminent. And we look forward to that. As I put myself in the bubble, the indictment still had not been issued, but we expect it soon. And if it has, I'm sorry, I at some point just have to stop looking at all the news as it comes in, and that's how we've been doing it since the very beginning. Okay, nothing new. Well, it looks like that bird has flown. I know you've heard that, but I gotta use it anyway because, hey, bye. There's a few points in life that are very important. And one is acknowledging that once they become an ex, you just have to let go. Now, relationships are like that, all right? As soon as they become an ex, you can't go grumbling back to them. You can't beg them to let me stay. No. He wants you to beg. And you don't give an ex your bank account. Okay, no banking info to an ex. Once they become an ex, don't do it. Only ruin goes that way. Okay? Just saying. All right. What if it's not X? What if it's 10? I've been telling everybody it's Twitter 10 because the first 9 Twitters he didn't like. But no, it's just X. Twitter is gone. The bird has flown. All right. Well, so will we then, I suppose. Yeah, I guess if you pay, you can get your DMs. What? That's what he's trying to do. And he wants your banking info. Do not give an ex your banking info. I keep repeating it. But do not. Just don't. Okay. Well, what a day. What a weekend. What a life. Alrighty. Well, it looks like we may be in a cooling trend. Hopefully, we're going to only be in the low 90s. They keep telling us that, and it keeps bumping into the hundreds here at the mothership. Please, no more heat. And then when it's icy and cold, it's like, oh gosh, I wish we had that really hot, uncomfortable heat again. It would be so nice. There was a Twilight Zone that addressed that issue about some people who were in an oncoming ice age, I believe. And then it turns out that they were just dreaming because they were actually in ungodly heat that was baking the planet. They were dreaming about being in a new ice age and how nice that would have been. And it wasn't nice. They hated it. Then they woke up. Or it could have been that they were in an ungodly baking heat wave that was cooking the planet, and they were dreaming about being in a new ice age. One or the other. But you know how it worked in Twilight Zone. Submitted for your approval. Or your consideration, actually. It's Monday. And should I use the excuse of not enough coffee? I've been doing that a lot. Haven't we all? Okay, what else is going on? I suppose we should just get into it because we might have to break away for a little bit longer on a break because I sense some care needs to be given, and that's okay. All right, well, what do we have in store for you here? Yeah, it looks like Georgia prosecutors could bring charges in the election probe as soon as 31 July. That's coming up. On the rest of the menu, the Justice Department threatened to sue after telling Texas the floating barrier the state put up on the Rio Grande violates federal, and I should add as well, international law. A Missouri school board taken over by Christian extremists revoked an anti-racism resolution, and a federal judge ruled that an Arizona law limiting how close people can get to recording law enforcement is unconstitutional. You can film them. After the break, we move to the chef's table where the right-wing extremist party in Spain failed in Sunday's election to control government for the first time since Franco. And Bulgaria agreed to send heavy military equipment to Ukraine for the first time since the invasion. All that and more on West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit. At netrootsradio.com. To the right of the page is the chat room link, and the chat room is monitored by Kelly Lincoln, and we thank Kelly for doing so, and everything else as well. To the left, across the page, to the left from that chat room link near the bottom of our homepage at netrootsradio.com is the link to our Patreon site. And if you could become a recurring Patreon of Netroots Radio, it really does help. If you could afford to send us what you might spend on an espresso-type coffee drink once a month, we were able to pool those funds with the funds of other like-minded folk, and it puts a big dent in our bills and all the other costs that we're able or have been incurred running this powerhouse of resistance. I will get it. It's Monday, you know. And so all that said, your help is direly needed, and thank you for your generosity in allowing us to fulfill our civic duty as the founders originally intended so many years ago. If you would like to follow Netroots Radio on Twitter, it's now X. I refresh the page. It's X. But my Twitter button still says tweet. The tweet button still says tweet. So maybe it is still Twitter for a while. Anyway, you can follow us on there until you can't. And also on Spoutable and Mastodon at Netroots Radio. Tom takes care of those. Thank you, Tom. Follow me on those media platforms as well. Is it X? Or are they going to rebrand it again? Because you can't trademark an X. He didn't know that. And he just found out. So now it's apparently it's temporary. Anyway, you can follow me on there. Also on Mastodon and Spoutable at Justice Putnam. I post the show notes and links diary on Daily Co's 10 minutes before showtime. And you can find those links to that show notes and links diary by following the links on my social media platforms. Those sites. Do it. Follow the show on Twitter or whatever it is now at Cookbook West. And please do pick up podcasts by way of Spreaker, not Stitcher, but you can do it on TuneIn, YouTube, iTunes, etc., etc., etc. Just not Stitcher anymore. Can't do it. Do it on Spreaker. That's what we do. All right, this first offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is out of the Associated Press. I'll get it out. And the reporter is Paul J. Weber. The Justice Department told Texas that a floating barrier of wrecking ball-sized boys that the state put in the Rio Grande violates federal law and raises humanitarian concerns for migrants crossing into the U.S. from Mexico. President Joe Biden's administration told Abbott, that's the Repub governor of Texas, we all know that the barrier installed this month near the border town of Eagle Pass, Texas, was unlawful in a letter dated on Thursday and obtained by the AP. The floating barrier poses a risk to navigation as well as public safety in the Rio Grande River, and it presents humanitarian concerns, reads the letter, which also informs the state that the Justice Department intends to sue if the barriers are not removed. Sue? Send in whatever authority that has any kind of, police and military powers and take them out. Jesus. Abbott's office did not respond to a request for comment, but on Twitter, the governor wrote that Texas was acting within its rights. Texas has the sovereign authority to defend our border, Abbott tweeted. Is it really a tweet anymore? Or is it an excrement? Maybe it's an excrement now. The boys are the latest escalation of Abbott's multi-billion-dollar operation to secure the state's 1,200-mile border with Mexico. Other measures have included razor wire fencing and arresting migrants on trespassing charges. The mission, known as Operation Lone Star, came under new scrutiny after a trooper said migrants had been denied water and that orders were given to push asylum seekers back into the Rio Grande. Asylum seekers. Drown them. The Texas Department of Public Safety said this week that the troopers' accounts, which were made in an email to a supervisor, are under internal investigation, which means they're trying to shut him up. Eagle Pass is part of a Border Patrol sector that has seen the second highest number of migrant crossings this fiscal year, though it is lower than at this time last year. The Biden administration has said illegal border crossings have declined significantly since new immigration rules took effect in May as pandemic-related asylum restrictions expired. Jim Salter of the Associated Press brings us this next offering here in the Bistro Cafe of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, River City Hash Mondays. In the national reckoning that followed the police killing of George Floyd 3 years ago, about 2,000 protesters took to the streets in a St. Louis suburb and urged the mostly white Francis Howell School District to address racial discrimination. The school board responded with a resolution promising to do better. Now, the board, led by new conservative board members, that's a nice way of calling them Christian extremists, by the way, white Christian extremists, that were elected last year, has revoked that anti-racism resolution, and copies of it will be removed from school buildings. The resolution passed in August of 2020 pledges, quote, to our learning community that we will speak firmly against any racism, discrimination, and senseless violence against people regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, immigration status, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or ability. Yeah, gotta get rid of that. Who gets rid of that? You know who gets rid of that. A Teutonic goose-stepping type, that's who it will. The board's decision follows a trend that began with backlash against COVID-19 pandemic policies in places around the nation. School board elections have become intense political battlegrounds, with political action groups successfully electing candidates promising to take action against teachings on race and sexuality, removing books deemed offensive, and stop transgender inclusive sports teams. In other words, the Nazis want a constitutional right to be bigots. Or worse. This final offering here in the Bistro Cafe part of West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. A federal judge has ruled that an Arizona law limiting how close people can get to recording law enforcement is unconstitutional, citing infringement against a clearly established right to film police doing their jobs. The ruling from U.S. District Judge John J. Tucci permanently blocks enforcement of the law that he suspended last year. The Republican-backed law was signed by former Republican Governor Doug Ducey in July of 22, but enthusiasm for the restrictions faded, and legislators refused an opportunity to defend the law during an initial court suspension. Republican State Senator John Kavanaugh, who sponsored the measure, has said he was unable to find an outside group to defend the legislation. The law would have made it illegal to knowingly film police officers 8 feet or closer if the officer tells the person to stop. And on private property, an officer who decides that someone is interfering or that the area is unsafe could have ordered the person to stop filming, even if the recording was being made with the owner's permission. The law prohibits or chills a substantial amount of First Amendment protected activity and is unnecessary to prevent interference with police officers, given other Arizona laws in effect, Tucci ruled. A coalition of media groups and the ACLU successfully sued to block the law. Prominent law enforcement officials refused to defend the law, including former Republican Attorney General Mark Brnovich and both the prosecutors and sheriff's office in Maricopa County, home to Phoenix. Well, that brings us to our break. And when we get back from that break, we will go through weather from around the world. And we will finish up with the stories that we've curated for you today. You are listening to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And we will be right back.
You are listening to netrootsradio.com.
Please hang up and try again.
From a point at sea to the circles of your mind, a new force is at work for planetary transformation. New radio for a new Earth.
This is Take Two Movie Review. I'm Clinton Johnston. This week, Facing the Impossible. Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible franchise continues to evolve. After summarizing their formula in our Mission Impossible Fallout review, I just watched Cruise and returning writer and director Christopher McQuarrie step away from it in Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Still, I thought I saw a lot of nods and one-ups to the franchise history. Was the final train sequence a tip of the hat to the bullet train in Mission Impossible? Was the narrow alley fight a nod to the alley scene in that first film's beginning? Sure, the train climb was probably just the latest climb, but I was back with the Burj Khalifa climb in Ghost Protocol, though I think the car chase steps off the reservation to tip a hat to the Pierce Brosnan Michelle Yeoh motorcycle chase in Tomorrow Never Dies, saying, classic, loved it, now we'll do it 3 times bigger. Plus we have so much returning cast: Peg, Rames, Ferguson, Vanessa Kirby, Henry Czerny is still Kittredge, and don't we love that? And all this familiarity balances how much Dead Reckoning Part 1 feels most like series outlier Mission Impossible 2. 1, because it's more idiosyncratic than its recent predecessors, and 2, because it has a persistently intense tone. Except for the levity in the car chase, good call, thanks. As for why this tone, let's talk Villain, a rogue advanced AI the movie calls the Entity. It can access any digitally stored information and thus can predict our plans and values, a hallmark concern in McQuarrie's Mission Impossibles. So what's the solution? In-person communication, and thus, Dead Reckoning Part 1 is a movie of faces. From the iconic Mission Impossible masks, from all the facial recognition scenes in the first acts, but mostly from McQuarrie's metric ton of close-ups. This movie is action scenes and close-ups, sometimes both together. So much so that Kittredge's final act line about it being better meeting face to real face feels emblematic. It's a bold strategy, and if you choose to accept it, we'll see you in Dead Reckoning Part 2. This has been Take Two Movie Review. I'm Clinton Johnston. Catch up with us at TakeTwoMovieReview.com and feed us back on our channel on YouTube.
This is Cosmos Quickly, and I'm Lee Billings. In this episode, we're talking with a nuclear historian about the new Christopher Nolan blockbuster, Oppenheimer, a film about one of the most complex and tragic figures of the early atomic age. I'm very pleased to welcome Alex Wellerstein to Cosmos Quickly. Alex is a nuclear historian and professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, and the author of the 2021 book, Restricted Data: The History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States. And Alex, welcome to the program.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
We're going to be talking about Christopher Nolan's new film, Oppenheimer, which Alex and I both saw at a pre-screening event a few days ago, and it blew our socks off in more ways than one. Should be a fun conversation. Tell us a little more about what you know about Oppenheimer, what your relationship to Oppenheimer is, and how that influenced how you viewed this movie.
I've been sort of thinking about Oppenheimer as a person and his history for about 20 years. And so it's a little odd to watch a movie about someone you've spent a lot of time reading their letters, their FBI files, their security hearing transcripts. I take some credit for essentially finding the unredacted versions of the security hearing transcript, which had been mislabeled and misfiled by the National Archives, and I found them on a lucky check. I've been thinking about Oppenheimer a long time, and trying to make sense of him. I'm not a biographer of Oppenheimer, so I'm not like in love with Oppenheimer. I haven't sort of internalized him as my hero subject. I think he's a pretty complicated character, and I'm interested in him as a complicated character and as part of the sort of complicated times.
Complicated times. And just to be clear, if it's not clear, we're talking about J. Robert Oppenheimer, the founding director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, often seen as the father of the nuclear weapons program in the United States and the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
First, your initial thoughts of the film. I'd love to get just your pocket review.
It's a hard pocket review. I'm going to be seeing it again in a couple of days, and I'm hoping that after that I will have a sense of how I really feel about the film. I had a friend ask me recently, like, "Oh, was it a good movie?" And I was like, "I don't know, right? Like, it depends what you mean by good movie. Like, it's not a fun movie to watch. It's not meant to be a fun movie. Is it a interesting portrait of Oppenheimer? Yeah. Does it do a better version of Oppenheimer than a lot of other film versions? Yes. Yes.
What exactly is the average person supposed to get from this movie? Because while it does, I think, take great pains to be considerably accurate, both in a scientific and a technical and a historical sense, it's a little overwhelming, and it's 3 hours, but there's so much squeezed in there. As an amateur scholar of nuclear history and not a professional like you, I found myself overwhelmed. I found myself very confused at points. I was wondering if I can't connect all these different dots, if I can understand, oh, who's that background character playing the bongos? Oh, that's Richard Feynman. What hope does the average person have?
Yeah, I have no idea. It's a really tall order. I'm sympathetic with the tall order of it. It's clear that Nolan wanted to do a lot of justice to the historical material. He does not distort it for the purpose of the narrative as much as a lot of previous people have. He doesn't just – it's not a standard biopic with the standard arc, right? We've all seen the Johnny Cash films, right? Like, they're great. It's a great film. We feel good about it. It has nothing to do with reality. That's fine, right? We kind of know that. It's not like that at all. I respect that it's very – deliberately made. So as a work of art, it's challenging for a blockbuster summer film. I told my friend, if you want to watch a fun movie, the Barbie one looks like it's going to be a lot more fun. This is not a fun movie. It doesn't mean it's not a useful or important movie, but it's not a fun movie.
Yeah, that's kind of what I want to get at is that it's not every day that you get a blockbuster like this, or a director, a screenwriter of this caliber, a cast of this quality coming together to kind of give you an excuse to talk about some of these issues that underpin a lot of our modern society and our global civilization. Really, I know that sounds very sweeping, but I mean, if you're not going to talk about nuclear weapons in that context, then what are you really talking about? And of course, there's this element of, again, kind of being bound by what's happened. I mean, in the same way that when James Cameron did the Titanic, spoiler alert, it sinks. Almost everybody dies. With Oppenheimer, spoiler alert, he has a remarkable rise and is at the pinnacle of the U.S. and the global nuclear establishment. And then he has this tragic fall from grace that comes about through the increased perception or need for security, for more national security measures to try to not necessarily put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, but just try to manage the damage, I guess.
It's tricky. You could imagine a film that doesn't do the second half of the arc, and Nolan tries to do everything. He tries to do Oppenheimer before he's on the Manhattan Project. He tries to do Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project. He tries to do Oppenheimer in the Cold War. Like, that's a lot to do in one film.
Yeah.
I kept thinking, I bet this would be better if it was multiple films or like a miniseries, right? Like, I bet if he could have a little bit more – if he could have 5 hours and that wasn't an overwhelming ask, that he could do all of these things and it would feel more satisfying. But because he only has 3 hours, and the fact that it's almost exactly 3 hours, that feels like a studio compromise type of situation.
Release the Nolan cut. I want the 5 hour.
I want the 10-hour op, and I want the extended. I want Peter Jackson, eat your heart out, right? But like that's, to me, is part of the choices he made as well. And on the one hand, I respect the choice. Like, covering Oppenheimer's early period is an interesting way to try and get into his character. I don't think he quite covers enough for it to be successful. Similarly, obviously the Los Alamos story is really important. I feel like he also doesn't cover enough. And similarly, the end of the, after Los Alamos, after World War II, he doesn't quite cover enough. And so there's this, I get this paradox where on the one hand, I'm saying it's way too long and there's too much. And there's another hand I'm saying, and he doesn't quite get, it's the like bad food in so small portions, right? It doesn't, it's a tricky thing. I respect him trying to do it. On the other hand, it does to me make it a tricky film to watch.
Was Oppenheimer ultimately successful? Do we live in a world that he really profoundly helped shape, not just from the detonations of Trinity and
Fat Man, Little Boy.
Yeah. But also through if we look at how nuclear nonproliferation occurs today, it's through the IAEA, I guess, also doing these sorts of inspections, and it does focus a lot on capability and on how much uranium do you have, how much of it is enriched, et cetera, to what degree. So was Oppenheimer, you think, ultimately kind of successful?
I think he would have seen himself as unsuccessful. And yeah, some of these things come up in later ways. One thing they say in the movie quite correctly is that Oppenheimer never expresses regret for World War II or what he did. I think there's a big misconception about Oppenheimer is that he regretted his activities and killing, so many people. He never expressed that regret. He always maintained that he didn't regret it and that it was important to do at the time. And they do get some of this across in the movie. Like his view was that the best thing you could do with the first nuclear weapons was make their use so horrible that maybe nobody would want to use them again. And in that sense, maybe he was successful. I do think he was successful in the sense that we have not just we today, but like Harry Truman came away thinking these are not regular weapons. These should not be used lightly. But I think that that's an important successful thing. But I think he would have felt unsuccessful because he felt that the worst case scenario would be a world in which nuclear weapons are made by the thousands and they are made in many, many megatons. And you have nations pointing them at each other with a hair trigger, and that this is inevitably going to, at some point in time, lead to more nuclear weapons use, and it'll be even worse. And I think he would have felt that he ultimately was unsuccessful in getting what he wanted, and that the world today, though, yes, it's not as bad. We haven't all died in a fiery nuclear holocaust, but that's a pretty low bar, right? Like he would see the current state of the world as being exceedingly dangerous and not where we need to be at all. Like it's still not at the right place, and it's not clear how you get to the right place.
What I find most interesting about the movie is where we go from here. It's nice to look at the past and what's come, but what does it tell us about the future? What are the conversations that you would like to see come out of this being kind of a pop cultural moment?
There are a lot of different ways you can try to make a World War II atomic bomb movie or an Oppenheimer movie, right? And like what has been done in the past is usually Oppenheimer, great hero, hooray, a great triumph of science, hurrah. You can have rise and fall, tragedy, and there's some of that, of course, in here. But he's really trying to make this also about like the world we live in and the sort of dark views of what's coming next. And that is a big part of actually Oppenheimer's worldview. I almost wish there was a way to do more of that in the movie. And again, if there had been anything on international control, like that's what that's about. That's the conversation. It's also the answer to some of these sort of puzzles raised by the movie. Like why does Oppenheimer support working on the H-bomb during World War II but not later? And part of that is because he's interested in the H-bomb during World War II because it's the promise of the thing to come. The World War II atomic bombs, you can imagine, these are kind of just like efficient versions of what we can already do. We can already destroy cities with firebombs. Why not just do it in one bomb? But the initial supers they're imagining range from 10 to 100 megatons. They do a calculation at Los Alamos during the war or just after it about how many of those you need to set off to make the atmosphere radioactively uninhabitable. And they do this with the World War II bombs, and they do this with their ideas of the super. And with the World War II bombs, you need like 10,000 going off, which during World War II, that feels like a long way away. They're doing a lot of work just to make 3, right? With the supers, they come down to between like 10 and 100. That is very achievable, right? Now, it turns out they're wrong, hooray. But like, I just bring this up that's the context of what Oppenheimer's thinking about with the super. He brings this up at meetings with politicians like Henry Stimson, who the Secretary of War, where he's trying to influence them to get very dedicated to this idea of international control, of banning nuclear weapons. And he's successful. I mean, the film kind of does Stimson dirty. It makes him look like a sort of foolish politician. He is not a foolish politician. Stimson is the guy who he gets all this. He believes that view. He goes to Truman and says, we need to negotiate with the Soviet Union to ban nuclear weapons or we'll all die. The first meeting Stimson has with Truman to tell him about the atomic bomb when Truman becomes president, he prefaces it by saying, like, we are going to be in a position to end civilization if we don't make the right decisions. Like, he is not treating this trivially at all. He has bought that line that he's getting from not just Oppenheimer, but a few other key people. And I sort of wish they had been able to do a little bit more with that. But like, to me, that's the more interesting thing than even the standard World War II version, the scientific triumph, even the Oppenheimer's personal, failings and losing the clearance. It's okay. So what are the options for the world moving forward? And to me, the really powerful thing about studying this period, especially the period that's not in the film, it was a period in which it felt like there were options and choices. And we end up in a world where it doesn't feel like there's any choices. And it's really hard to get people today to think about there being any choices. People will tell you straight up, I don't know how you can't possibly do anything about the state of the world, about nuclear weapons. There's no way to move forward. Of course, we need them, blah, blah, blah. And we do have choices. And I'm not saying they're easy choices. I'm not saying we all hug each other and sing Kumbaya and everybody gets rid of the weapons. There are practical ways to think about, okay, what would we need to do to get into a world where we are not existentially threatened by nuclear warfare? It doesn't even necessarily mean getting rid of all the weapons, though there's a lot of people who'd prefer that. It could mean reducing the number to a level where it's not existential if they got used. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. But like, those are the kinds of conversations that I think people ought to be having in a more broad way, not just seeing it as a sort of simple issue. And so if the movie in any way encourages that, I would say big success.
Beautiful. Alex, thank you for sitting down with me today to talk about this movie and about its reflections and echoes and shadows of real life. Cosmos Quickly is a part of Scientific American's podcast, Science Quickly. If you like the show, please give us a rating or review. This show was produced by Talika Bose, Kelso Harper, Jeff Delvicio, and Corinne Leong. Our show's music was composed by Dominic Smith. And before you go, please consider supporting independent journalism like this. Become a Scientific American subscriber today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify. For Cosmos Quickly, I'm Lee Billings.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, and since you're listening to netrootsradio.com, show your progressive side and go to the donate button on the bottom of the homepage. It's progressives like you who power Netroots Radio and keep the progressive message beaming everywhere 24 hours a day. Just go to our donate button at the bottom of netrootsradio.com. Thank you for keeping progressive radio at full power.
A book goes home. I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. The book's author was James Clerk Maxwell, not exactly a household name. And the book, titled An Elementary Treatise on Electricity, well, never exactly topped a bestseller list. Not surprising, since the book is, as the New York Times story put it, crammed with technical jargon and mathematical equations. The book was published in 1881, and the New Bedford, Massachusetts Public Library acquired a copy in 1882. So far, so good. But after being checked out in 1905, it wasn't returned. Fast forward 118 years to May 2023, when the Massachusetts Library received a note from the rare books curator at the West Virginia University Library that read, "We have recently received a donation that included a book from your library. Would you like it returned?" The answer was yes, and it was. And yes, we were concerned about late fees too. They were a penny a day in 1905 when the book was checked out, so they could have been over $400. Fortunately, decades ago, late fees were capped at $2. This is indeed a feel-good story. What we can feel even better about is a 2023 news story about a library that, for a change, isn't about censors, trying to pull a book off the shelf, but rather about a book going home. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU because freedom can't protect itself.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1968. That was the first day of a new U.S. labor partnership, the Alliance for Labor Action. The alliance was forged by the President of the United Auto Workers, Walter Reuther, and the President of the Teamsters Union, Frank Fitzsimmons. The UAW had left the AFL-CIO over differences on how to approach labor organizing. The newly formed alliance with the Teamsters stood as a progressive alternative to the AFL-CIO's approach at the time. The ALA called for forming community unions for the millions of poor and unorganized workers. It supported the civil rights movement as well as the movement against the war in Vietnam. One of the ALA's slogans was, quote, to find answers to the urgent problems of our society. The ALA developed position papers on a series of issues. One of those urgent problems was health care. The ALA described, quote, the United States is the last remaining industrialized country in the world which does not have a national health insurance plan which would assure all its citizens at least minimum guarantee of access to needed medical care. In 1969, the ALA launched its first major organizing drive in Atlanta, Georgia. The drive targeted multiple industries and included a massive advertising campaign. But the Atlanta business community stood in staunch opposition to the unionization effort. Despite some successes, the Atlanta effort did not garner the hoped-for results. The ALA suffered another blow when Walter Reuther died in a plane crash in May of 1970. The alliance disbanded in 1972. Universal health care and many of the other causes championed by the ALA remain unrealized.
Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Thank you for accompanying us here to the chef's table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy River City Hash Mondays. We always begin weather from around the world along the banks of the Rogue River in the Rogue River Valley of Southern Oregon, on the west coast of the continental United States of America, where it is currently 60 degrees Fahrenheit, sunny conditions, a bit cooler than what we had over the weekend. We are expecting highs of only around 90, only. Winds will be out of the west-northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. We are under an air quality alert, though the air quality has been quite good here in our little hamlet of Rogue River. We'll get to that in a moment. Clear skies overnight with lows around 60 and winds out of the northwest at 5 to 10. Mainly sunny tomorrow with highs in the low 90s. Winds out of the northwest at 5 to 10 miles per hour. Grass pollen is rated moderate, so that's come down a little bit here in Rogue River. The air quality index for the region is in the good range at 19 parts per million, and that daytime UV index, though it is rated very high, has come down a notch to level 8. Barometric pressure is falling at 30.07 inches. Visibility is up to 10 miles, and relative humidity is at 58%. Weather from around the world is brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. And that's the Weather Underground. London is 63 degrees with showers in the vicinity. Paris is 72 and cloudy with a thunderstorm advisory. Rome is 97 and sunny with a heat advisory. Kyiv is 82 and mostly cloudy. Kabul is 74 and partly cloudy. Hong Kong is 85 and fair. Tokyo is 80 degrees and clear. Sydney, Australia is 44 degrees and fair. San Francisco, California is 56 and mostly cloudy. And New York, New York is a sweltering 80 degrees Fahrenheit and fair. And that is weather from around the world, brought to you by a crowd of crowdsourced weather stations that a crowd crowdsources from around the world. Ciaran Giles and Joseph Wilson of the Associated Press brings us this first amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, River City Hash Mondays. Spain appears headed for political gridlock after yesterday's inconclusive national elections left parties on both right and left without a clear path toward forging a new government. The Conservative, that's a nice way of calling them, neo-fascists, Popular Party won the elections, but it fell short of its hopes of scoring a much bigger victory and forcing the removal of Socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. Instead, the party led by Alberto Núñez Feijóo performed below the expectations of most campaign polls. Even though Sanchez's socialists finished second, they and their allied parties celebrated the outcome as a victory since their combined forces gained slightly more seats than the Popular Party and the far right. The bloc that would likely support Sanchez totaled 172 seats, the right bloc behind Feijóo 170, or is it Feijóo? The closer-than-expected outcome was likely to produce weeks of political jockeying and uncertainty over the country's future leadership. The next prime minister only would be voted on once lawmakers are installed in the new Congress of Deputies.
Je te donne ce mon amour pour la vie entière, la promesse de me trouver à tes genoux. Aussitôt que tu m'appelles, rester toujours fidèle, c'est tout, c'est tout. Je te donne tous mes printemps, mes étés de mer, mes automnes quand les feuilles tombent partout. Si ce n'est pas une bonne affaire, je te donne tous mes hivers.
Staff at the Associated Press brings us this final amuse-bouche here at the Chef's Table at West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bulgaria has agreed to provide the Ukrainian army with some 100 armored personnel carriers, marking a turnaround in the NATO members' policy on sending military equipment to Kyiv following the appointment of a new pro-Western government. Direct arms sales were rejected by previous interim governments appointed by President Rumen Radev. He is sympathetic to Russia and recently said that Ukraine was to be blamed for the war and that supplying arms to Ukraine only prolongs the conflict. The parliament in Sofia late on Friday approved by 148 votes to 52 the government's proposal to make the first shipment of heavy military equipment to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. The Soviet-made armored vehicles were delivered in the 1980s to Bulgaria, then an ally of the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. Bulgaria, which joined NATO in 2004, still maintains stocks of Soviet-designed weapons and has numerous factories making ammunition for them. Although Parliament approved in principle at the end of last year the provision of military aid to Ukraine, it left the decision about the parameters of such aid to the executive. And amid political instability in Bulgaria over the past months, previous administrations had rejected the idea. But the new government, appointed in June, has now moved to send the armored vehicles to Ukraine, along with armaments and spare parts. Well, that brings us to the end of our broadcast period for the day, but you do know Netroots Radio broadcasts on, and we will meet up here tomorrow for Terrytown Chowder Tuesdays. So do stay tuned to Netroots Radio all day and all night for all the breaking news as it breaks, and we will meet up here tomorrow, right here in West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Bon appetit.
Je voudrais du soleil vert, des dentelles et des théières, des photos de bord de mer, dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je voudrais de la lumière, comme en Nouvelle-Angleterre. Je veux changer d'atmosphère, dans mon jardin d'hiver. À fleurs sous la pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, qu'il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Je voudrais du Fred Astaire, revoir un latte Goël. Je voudrais toujours te plaire dans mon jardin d'hiver. Je veux déjeuner par terre, comme aux langues de golfe clair. T'embrasser les yeux ouverts dans mon jardin d'hiver. Pluie de novembre, tes mains qui courent, je n'en peux plus de t'attendre. Les années passent, il est loin, là je tombe. Nul ne peut nous entendre. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Ba-da-da-dum-di-da-dum. 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 Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver. Dans mon jardin d'hiver.